we are going to enter into Revelation 17 and 18 this morning. But because there is so much to kind of prepare the uninitiated to when it comes to some of these chapters, I wanted to start out by just kind of doing an add-on introduction in a little less formal way than going verse by verse through it. I want my desire is to introduce us to this text, begin to get us comfortable with this text, so when we really start to pick it apart, you understand why I'm taking the approach that I'm going to take as we go through this. To preface that process, over the next few weeks, because this will be the last time we meet for a couple of weeks, I want you, as a part of your daily study, I don't care where else you study or what else you're studying, but take the time to go through these two chapters, Revelation 17 and 18. They kind of go together. They deal with one topic. And familiarize yourself with what the text says. So that way, when we break it apart into its constituent parts, you are at least aware, you have a familiarity with the text. As you go through and as you do that in your own study time, write down in your study journal what you have questions about. Write down things that don't make sense to you. Because as we spend our time going through this, I want to see how many of those questions we begin to answer. It should be illuminating to you to see the things you don't understand come to light. Also, if you think you understand something, jot down what you think it means. It could be illuminating to find out that something you feel you've been taught is maybe a tradition that needs to be re-examined. Because as I dove into getting ready to prepare these chapters for you, it was one of those times where God really grabbed me, by the collar and said, hold on, slow down. You're not just going to charge ahead through this. And in his wisdom and in his timing, not only did he lead me to things that I needed to study, but through various discussion groups that I'm in, this topic would come up, or through a podcast that I'm listening to, it would be the subject of a podcast. I wasn't even seeking it out. And I began to see that there are all kinds of strange beliefs and strange errors that get bandied about by Christians. And most Christians don't even realize that they're rooted in incorrect teachings on these two chapters. So it became really apparent to me that not only do we need to understand what it says, but we also need to be grounded in what other people believe it to say, so that if we come across some of these things from other well-meaning believers, we have that ability to discern, I know where you're coming from. I've at least been exposed to this. We had a situation where, one of our attendees encountered the very first time a well-meaning, believing Christian who really believes the earth is flat. And, that is not the status of what we teach in this church. Science and faith are not at odds, but there becomes a lot of conspiratorial talk that comes out of those kind of beliefs. And a very similar issue takes place with Revelation 17 and 18. A lot of conspiracies that conservatives, Christians, sometimes buy into are rooted in unfounded, wrong teachings that can come out of these chapters. We just finished, in our Revelation series, taking a look at chapter 15 and chapter 16, where we dealt with the bowl judgments. We dealt with the beast of the land and the beast of the sea and their identities and who they're going to be. People spend so much time trying to pick that up and name that person today. And when we did that teaching, we said the Antichrist is probably alive today. He's probably been alive since Jesus left the planet, because the devil has always had to have someone ready to step in if God triggers the end time scenario. The enemy doesn't trigger the end time scenario. God does. So the devil has to be ready to play that game. But there are people out there, you see these types of conspiracies that are out there. I dealt with somebody this past week who firmly believes to this day that Barack Obama is the Antichrist and that the mark of the beast is the COVID vaccine. And we kind of laugh about that stuff. And they brought up, the mark of the beast is out there, be ready. And so I just asked him, I said, what is the mark of the beast? Well, it's the tracking that's in the COVID-19 vaccine. I said, well, who's the Antichrist? Well, Obama is. And I said, so the Bible declares that, the Antichrist is more than likely of Assyrian descent. Obama's of Kenyan descent. How do you reconcile that? I started asking questions based on what Scripture actually says, and of course I get no answers. You just get a conspiratorial theory and no answers. And the problem is, if we don't know how to lay those kinds of things to rest, then Christianity can become what the world sees it to be, which is weird and goofy. And I'm not saying we're ever going to get the world to buy in, but remember, we are challenged to be ready always to give a reason for what we believe. And that will happen even when it comes to Christians who are genuinely seeking the truth, who are coming up against Christians who have believed something that is fanciful or not grounded in Scripture. And it is our responsibility to be able to take that stuff and say, well, let's discuss that. Let's analyze that according to what Scripture says. And these two chapters, one, they're incredibly timely. A lot of people are looking at them right now. They're trying to figure things out. They're trying to, as has been the case for a long time, but they're trying to shoehorn Bible prophecy into today's headlines, and that's always dangerous. But you're going to face these things out there, and the way you establish yourself as a well-reasoned, critical thinking believer is to understand the views that are out there, and then to be able to reason from the Scripture what is the most spiritual means, accurate means of rightly dividing this text, okay? And to equip, that's what my mission is. My mission is to equip everybody within the sound of my voice with the ability to do that. And unfortunately, just rattling our way through the text in a session or two isn't going to equip you to do that. So this is going to be a bank, a knowledge bank of information that you can come back to, because I don't expect everybody to get it on the first run-through. Unfortunately, most teachers are just going to give you their interpretation of it, and they're never going to look at the flaws of their view. Okay? Always willing to take a look at the flaws of the view that we look at. We will mention some of those as we go. But, for instance, I was challenged by the Lord to go through a book, dedicate, 8 hours of audio, more hours of study to listening to this audio book that has a very unique view on these two chapters. And I went through it just to be a diligent student, to hear what the opposition says. And I noticed some things. They set up really strict criteria for how the other views have to be judged. But when they get to the chapters explaining their view, they have rescuing devices for the parts of their view that don't fit the criteria that everybody else had to adhere to. My hope for everybody within the sound of my voice would be, as we go through this study, it wouldn't just be a study on Revelation 17 and 18, but it would be an exercise in honing your discerning ears so you can begin to come to the place where if you are dealing with anything in Christianity that has divided views on it among believers and denominations and such, you can begin to discern when people aren't holding themselves to the same standard that they're holding other people's views to. That is something that as mature disciples in Christ, we just don't spend enough time doing, and then we don't know how to sort out the chaff from the wheat sometimes. Does that make sense? So with that as an introductory kind of point, what I want to do together as a body is just read these two chapters together and then open your eyes to some terms I'm going to use later on as we go through this. And that way, when I use them, if I don't completely expound upon what they are there, this is something that can be referred back to at your leisure, so that when you are studying this stuff, you have this wealth of information in one place, as opposed to having to go to all the resources I did to find it. Does that make sense? That's really what I'm trying to accomplish for you guys. So let's go to Revelation, and we're going to go to chapter 17, and we're just going to read 17 and 18 in context together. My phone will wake up for me here, because I want to familiarize you guys with the text. So Revelation 17, verse 1 says, "Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me." So first off, here we are. The 7 bowls have been completed, and now we're getting this zeroing in on something. Because remember, one of the last bowls that was poured out back in verse 16 was the falling of Babylon. And we heard about that in 15 and 16, the destruction of Babylon. Babylon is fallen, etc., etc. So we're coming in off of that. And the angel says, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones of pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written: Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. But the angel said to me, why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was, and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. Boy, that's a heady verse. Verse 9 says, here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7th, and is going to perdition. Everybody follow that? Okay. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they received their authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. Then he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So here we know these waters are symbolic, at least in one sense. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. So the beast eventually turns on the harlot and consumes her. For God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman whom you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. So verse 18 of chapter 17 is, in fact, a startling revelation. Because this isn't a woman. This isn't a specific person like the Antichrist or the false prophet were specific people. This harlot, this woman, is a city. That's really important. With that in mind, let's look at chapter 18. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. Verse 4 says, And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works. In the cup which she has mixed, mix double for her. In the measure that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow. For she says in her heart, I sit as queen, and am no widow, and I will not see sorrow. Therefore her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judges her. Verse 9, the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, the great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. For the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble, and cinnamon and incense, fragrant oil and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and bodies and souls of men. The fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you, and all the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all. The merchants of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. Every shipmaster, all who travel by ships, sailors, and as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance, and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What is like this great city? They threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city, in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth. For in 1 hour she is made desolate. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found anymore. The sound of harpists, musicians, flautists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you anymore. Nor craftsmen of any craft shall be found in you any more. And the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you any more. The light of a lamp shall not shine in you any more. And the voice of a bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you any more. For your merchants were the great men of the earth. For by your sorcery all the nations were deceived. And in her was found the blood of the prophets and saints, and all who were slain on the earth. These 2 chapters are some of the most commented on, most written about, and most widely varied views on in any of the book of Revelation. But from chapter 18, we springboard into chapter 19, and chapter 19 is the final battle. Chapters 20, 21, and 22, those are the wrap-up of the story. So these two chapters that we're dealing with, they demand our respect, they demand our attention, they demand that we take the time in our study lives to familiarize ourselves with them, when normally what would happen is we would gloss it over because there's a lot of stuff that is going on there. Okay? Now, what I want to do is I want to take what one scholar did, and this is a scholar who I don't even agree with his conclusions, but he did an excellent job of kind of laying out what's at stake, and I want to give you this structure because you're going to see me refer back to this in our more formal presentation-based sessions that we're going to do. So there are several criteria, a list of several criteria, that whatever this mystery Babylon is, has to meet according to Revelation 17 and 18. And I want to give them to you for your consideration over the next couple weeks of your study time. The first is that this Babylon has to be a literal city. Throughout Revelation 17 and 18, the last days Babylon is referred to a city 8 times. 17 verse 18, 18:10, 18:16, 18:18 through 19, and 18:21. The prophecy goes on to detail what must be understood as a very literal list of many of her primary imports in 18:11 through 13. Other portions of the prophecy describe her in ways that can only be ascribed to a literal geographic location. So that's number one. Whatever this Babylon is, it has to be a literal city. Why is that important? Because there is a view that it's not a literal city. Anytime the Bible declares exactly what something is, you can bet somebody's going to come along and say it's not that. There is a view that Mystery Babylon is a global conspiracy, once called the Illuminati, once called the New World Order, once, now it gets labeled globalist a lot. And I'm not saying any of those things aren't bad, but that is what some prophecy buffs say is Mystery Babylon. That it's not a literal city. That it's a metaphorical city. That it's a metaphorical political view. No, this is the political view of a city. It is the religious view of a literal city. But for the prophecy to be 100% true, it is speaking of an actual city. So then the question becomes, what city? And there are all kinds of views that say it's Rome. There's a lot of views that say Rome because it has 7 hills surrounding it. This must be the 7 mountains. I will show you that even in the apostolic period or the period of the early church fathers, it became common for those writers, Peter did it, to call Rome Babylon in a metaphorical sense. And the historicist view of Revelation, that Revelation has been fulfilled throughout history, that vilifies Vatican Rome, and I'm not saying there's anything good or right or whatever about Vatican Rome, makes the Pope the Antichrist, so therefore the harlot needs to be Rome itself. And there's a lot of teaching on this. Alexander Hislop in his The Two Babylons makes this case. David Hunt brings that case into a more modern vernacular and builds that case that Babylon is Rome. There's some real problems with that view, but it's so prevalent, you guys are going to need to know what the problems are, because it doesn't always work. And so we'll take a look at that. The next list on criteria is it does need to be a great city, not just any city. Mystery Babylon is probably not Buckley or Mansalona. Okay? It has to be a great city, a big, an influential city. Okay? The greatness of this city could rest in her vast size. The emphasis seems to focus more on the far-reaching and vast influence over earthly kings, leaders, and various peoples. The city's greatness is found in the fact that it's more than just a city alone, but is part of a larger geopolitical sphere of influence. During the biblical period, many great cities of renown were the hearts of the larger city-state that they reigned over. Ancient Babylon was the headquarters of the Babylonian Empire, right? Nineveh was the headquarters of the Assyrian Empire, right? Hierapolis, other cities, they could be linked to their empires, and so you could in effect say, Rome was the head of the Roman Empire. So to say something came out of Rome or the will of Rome, that extended to the entire empire. Now, at the beginning of chapter 17, the Apostle John is shown a city that in the Greek is an eremos, or a desert. That is what the Greek means. And that word Greek, the eremos in the Greek, it doesn't mean necessarily, or it doesn't mean a metaphorical desert. That word is used of a literal desert. So we should be able to say that this is probably a city that is located in a desert region. That is one of the reasons why Rome doesn't work. See what I'm saying? There's another view out there, believe it or not, that Mystery Babylon and the picture of the harlot herself is the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. And that New York is Mystery Babylon. And that America is the great harlot. And this is taught by Christian pastors and Christian teachers in American churches. But again, because of this Greek word that is used there, it doesn't fit. Those are some of the things that we're looking at, okay? Now, this is one of the things that makes a couple of the views really hard. The Bible strongly indicates, your fourth indicator here, that she is a city that is close to, or at least nearby, the sea. She is a port city. Because after the destruction of the city, those who lament and mourn her loss are specifically mentioned as shipmasters, passengers, sailors. They make their living by the sea. They stood at a distance and cried when they saw the smoke of her burning, Revelation 18, 17 through 19, for all who had ships at sea became rich by her. So you have a desert city that somehow accesses water. The view that we would bring you, there is a view that it's a literal reborn Babylon. And those who contest our view, they sit there and they say that Babylon is nowhere near the water. So that can't possibly be it. I'm going to come back to that issue in a moment at the end of the session because I want you to understand one of the problems of interpretation that seems to haunt even the most diligent scholars. And it's something that we have to bear in mind. Now, the fifth criterion from the prophecy is that it is a city that promotes the murder of both Jews and Christians. We're going to go over all of this again, but in your study time, I want you thinking about these things. Revelation 17:6 says, it is a city that is drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. So this is a city that persecutes Christians. The author of this particular list that I'm giving you, Joel Richardson, is a major proponent that the Antichrist will be an Islamic Antichrist. In fact, that's one of the titles of one of his books. He also wrote a book called The Mideast Beast. So as you can imagine, he is a proponent that the desert city that fulfills all of this is Mecca, the capital of the Islamic belief system. And as I was saying, he goes through all of these criteria and applies it to Rome, applies it to New York, applies it to the global conspiracy theory, even applies it to the literal Babylon view. But the fact that Mecca is not a port city, he comes up with a rescuing device for. And a discerning believer will go, okay, that's interesting, but you're really just bailing out your view. And we can see that. Okay? But there is no different than it is an error to try to vilify Rome and Roman Catholicism as the church has done for centuries, it becomes an error to exclusively vilify Islam as the coming Antichrist system. One of the reasons for that is men like Richardson, they deny possible prophetic interpretations of Psalm 83, strong literal commentaries on books like Obadiah and interpretations of Ezekiel 38 and 39 that seem to discuss that Israel, prior to the return of Christ, is going to deal with the Islamic situation to such a degree that, one, Islam is no longer the force that it is on the planet today, creating a religious vacuum in much of the Middle East, and two, redrawing the map of the Middle East in such a way that those of us that are alive today who remain on the planet after the rapture might not recognize the map. The potential expansion of Israel's borders, according to Ezekiel 38 and 39, is incredible. But commentators like Richardson, who like this Islamic interpretation, they set all that aside. They don't believe it. You have to at least deal with it. When Jesus comes back, he's not strictly defeating Islam. When Jesus comes back, he's defeating the Antichrist system and those who have allied themselves with the Antichrist. Richardson needs that to be one and the same. The Bible is more nuanced. That's why this isn't easy stuff for me to just break down for you. We're going to do a little mini-series before we get to Revelation 19, after we're done with this, that walks us through Psalm 83, Obadiah, Ezekiel 38 and 39. So you can look at those things, examine them, study it for yourself, and see that it is possible that the map is going to be completely redrawn. And we need to pay attention to that. It's possible that it's not, but we need to pay attention to that. Number 6 on your list, this city is hidden in plain sight. We are told that this city says in her heart, I will sit as queen, and I am not a widow, and I will never see mourning. This is a picture of a city governed by arrogance, convinced that despite her brazenness, she will never be dethroned. Her declaration that no one sees me, Isaiah 47, also points to the belief that her shamelessness goes unnoticed by most. She is hidden, as it were, in plain sight. In the midst of her debauchery, murders, and corruption, she believes that most are unaware of her sins. The spiritual and financial capital, he says, of the Islamic world. I don't necessarily think that that's true. But we do know that this city will be utterly destroyed forever. And for those that hold to the view that we intend to share and stand by, and I stand not alone in this, men like Chuck Missler, men like Andy Woods, a lot of other teachers, they hold to this view. When Babylon was historically conquered at the fall that we see in Daniel chapter 5, okay, when the writing was put on the wall, many Tekel Yip's version, she was taken without a fight. King Cyrus of Persia describes how they dug under the river and they lowered it, and the troops were able to go in, and the city was conquered without a war. They took over the city. Darius became the king over the city. Daniel served under Darius, right? And it was not a big conquering war, but chapters like Jeremiah 13 and 14, and chapters in Jeremiah 51 and 52, Isaiah 13 and 14, they talk about how Babylon will be destroyed and nothing will ever live there again. But in Iraq right now, there is a city where the ruins of Babylon are, and it's still an inhabited city. It's not Babylon, but Saddam Hussein was trying to rebuild it. Those other prophecies have never been literally fulfilled. And other commentators come and say, well, they don't need to be literally fulfilled. Okay. Does God mean what he says? Does he say what he means? So those are issues that you need to be able to understand. So whatever our view of the harlot Babylon may be, it must conform to all of the criteria in this chapter. Not that we have reviewed these now that we've reviewed them, we're going to talk about some of those other things. So I want to talk about a problem that plagues Christians, and I really don't think it should. And the problem is, it plagues us no matter what side of the denominational line we fall on. And I talked about this several sessions back, where I started to go back to those 4 different views on the trumpets and all of those things, and I kind of just briefly gave you an overview of all these different views and how they interpret Revelation. If we were, instead of this session being about end times, we were having a discussion about origins. We were talking about creation. Well, there's a debate in Christianity there that we're far more familiar with. We've talked about it a lot, and that is the view of a young earth creationist. The earth is only about 6,000 years old, versus an old earth creationist, which are Christians who make room for the millions of years required by evolution, because their goal is to make science agree with the Bible, or the Bible agree with science, right? And the number one principle that is required for a belief in the millions and millions of years that are necessary for evolution is a belief in something called uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism, that's a big word. We don't use it all the time. But what it means is that the present is the key to the past. So as things are today, they always were. So if we see sediments being deposited at a rate today, to calculate how long back it took to make the fossil record, and we base it on the rate we see it being done today, then we know that the earth must be millions and millions of years old, right? If we see how long it took a river to carve out the Grand Canyon, it must have been millions and millions of years, because this is how slow it's happening today. If we see radioactive isotopes giving off their radiation today, then that must mean that these things are this old, right? It's a way of working from the present backwards. Well, unfortunately, uniformitarianism has a lot of presuppositions in it that fail. Like, what was the original rate of something? How much was there to begin with? Nobody was there, so we don't know. We're just calculating it back from present rates. It has the presupposition built into it that things have always happened at the same rate as we see them happening today, and no outside forces have ever acted upon them to cause it to happen faster. It's a problem. You have to assume that that is true for uniformitarianism to work. Now, why do I take the time to say that? Because when it comes to eschatology, when it comes to end times things, Christians seem to fall into the same trap. In other words, our interpretation of the end time scenario is saying that the present, the way things are right now, is the key to the future. The way we see the map right now is the way that the map has to be before the 7 years of the Great Tribulation begin. There are no events that change the map prior to that, so therefore we have to base our current prophetic interpretation on what we see in front of us right now. If that's not the case, then prophetic interpretation is really messed up. Geography, politics, the religions that control the world. I mean, let's face it, my friends, Islam has only been a thing for the last 1,400 years. The world prior to that didn't even know what it was. Christianity has only been a thing for the last 2,000 years. The world prior to that didn't even know what it was. We are full of hubris to expect that the world we know today is the world that is going to take place. Why are we full of hubris? Because how many things have we studied in our Revelation commentary so far today that describe massive cosmic upheaval? Meteors striking, waters being turned into blood, the very things that create oxygen in our atmosphere being killed, all of that stuff that we've read about in the trumpet judgments, all of that stuff that we've read about in the bowl judgment, that happens prior to this moment. You with me? But most theological interpretations you are going to look at, as I said before, if you remember that four-pronged arrow that I put up when we looked at these different views as we came through the trumpet judgments, we got to our arrow, the futurist arrow, and even there, it split. And you started to have commentators who believed that they were metaphorical judgments and not literal judgments because they become too extreme. They become too wild. They become too fanciful. Christians, and this is a lot of denominations, period, they have no problem believing in miracles if they happened 2,000 years ago in Galilee. They have no problem in God sending down meteors to destroy his enemies in the book of Judges. But if we start talking about it actually happening in a supernatural way in our lifetimes, well, that's just messed up. That's probably nuclear bombs. That's probably something that we can conceive of in our own terms and in our own vernacular. I submit to you, God means what he says, and he says what he means. And we can't allow even the best teachers, the Christ-loving, God-fearing teachers, to shoehorn what the Bible is talking about into terminology that fits the mold of our present understanding. Does that make sense? Because that is one of the greatest errors that has ever taken place with eschatological commentary. If you go back to older end times commentaries, Matthew Henry in the 1600s, the Puritan commentator, or people before that, they were always guilty of trying to shoehorn what the world was in their view and make Revelation mean that. We have to allow Revelation to say what it says and interpret our view of what's going to happen based on God's reality, not our reality. Does that make sense? Can the whole earth be upset and turned over, and the geopolitical maps and the religious maps and even the actual geographic maps be turned upside down in a short period from the rapture to the beginning of the tribulation? Absolutely. And we're naive to think that it can't. We're naive to put the world in a general sense of utter panic. You subtract millions of people from it in the blink of an eye, and then you turn everything else that they've ever called normal upside down. And anybody that offers peace or security, people will bow down and worship. Look at what has happened in 2020 for just the smallest sense of that. Now, in this church, we do a lot of teaching, and we describe that prior to 701 BC, the world was a rough neighborhood, and there were catastrophic events that took place, more than likely, on a period of 54 and 108 years as Mars, our nearest neighbor, passed by this planet and caused tremendous, violent upheaval. I submit to you, with the kind of stuff that is described in the book of Revelation, the entire solar system, as we know it, can truly go through travail prior to a new heaven and a new earth being created. And I think most of our explanations have not gone far enough. I want you to think about that as you study. I encourage you to read other authors. I encourage you to listen to other teachers, because we're going to go down this road. We are going to present the view that it is a literal rebuilt Babylon. But you say, well, Babylon's not a port city. Man, I tell you what, we just reviewed the 7 letters to the 7 churches. Just a few hundreds of years ago, Ephesus was a port city. It's not today. When you start having meteor strikes and you start having plagues poured out upon the waters and you start having mountains bow down the way the Bible literally describes, God can move where the shoreline is. People are shocked when the shoreline moves a couple of feet in Michigan on the Great Lakes. Let me tell you, I don't think we've seen anything yet. So as we begin to go through this process, I want you to realize that I'm not talking about anything extraordinary. I'm just talking about things that are beyond the limited scope of what we call normal. Because normal is not the 200 years of history that America has been on the planet. Normal is not the 1,000 or so years of history, 1,500 years of history that Western Europe has been forming its nations. There was a lot of history in this world prior to that, and God sees the bigger picture. Are you with me? So I just wanted to spell those things out as we begin to head into that. Take that list of things I've given you. Familiarize yourself with this text, because I don't want it to be foreign to you when we begin to discuss it. Does that make sense?